Personally, as a trans, queer person who is not male or female, one of the biggest difficulties is not being taken seriously, and basically my gender being seen as either a phase or something that isn't real. And this is something that happens not only in wider society but also within trans communities. So the difficulties are multifaceted. Another aspect is stigma in the healthcare system, because it is often, even when trans people do have access to trans-specific healthcare, it's often geared towards trans men and trans women. And then if somebody wants anything or needs anything that's outside of those standard procedures, it's often stigmatized, and therefore it makes it more difficult to access the care. So for example, I was taking testosterone for 4 years, and then I decided to stop with hormone therapy, but I have not seen a doctor about this for the past several years, primarily because of the stigma that I know is attached to it. Because doctors often say things like, oh, there are all these random things people want. What would happen if I wanted to cut off my arm, and comparing it to things like this as if it is not a legitimate need, and the needs of trans men and trans women are more legitimate. So even though as an activist I do know how important it is to have medical supervision when changing things on your body, I have still chosen not to seek that supervision because of stigma. So I would say those are maybe the biggest things, along with just the day-to-day, running into people on the street and not knowing what to expect, not knowing how they will perceive me, how they will interact with me, and then how I should behave in order not to, for example, be attacked or questioned about who I am or what I am.
What was it like growing up in a cisnormative environment? Honestly, I think that largely my parents were confused. They didn't really understand who I was or who I might become, and tried to guide me in the best ways they could think of, but many of those, for me, tried to push me in a direction that I knew didn't fit. But neither of us, neither my parents nor me, could really communicate about why it didn't fit or why it mattered. And I think for all of us, it was confusing and painful. Not hostile, just difficult to understand. And I wasn't exposed to the idea of trans people or the fact that people could be trans or even LGBT generally until I was in my teenage years. The moment that I heard of lesbians, I came out as a lesbian, because I knew that the image of what a girl should grow up to be, this straight woman, was wrong. That I knew. I knew that the path that I had been taught was mine was the wrong path. So the moment I got a new path, I jumped at it. And I was about 14 when that happened. And then when I was 17, I heard about trans people for really the first time in my life, and again, immediately came out as trans. I didn't hide who I was from my parents, but I remember being really scared about how they would react both times, when I came out as lesbian and when I came out as trans. And I think a lot of that fear came from the very well-intentioned efforts to guide me to being the right kind of adult towards a productive and happy life that they tried to give me as a child. But unfortunately, what they were trying to guide me towards wasn't in my future, and I couldn't conceptualize how to become that person. And honestly, I spent most of my childhood thinking I wouldn't live to be an adult because I couldn't imagine myself as an adult woman. When I finally did come out as trans, my parents wanted, at the core, for me to be happy and for me to find a way forward in life that worked for me. And I don't think they or I could have imagined what that would look like, but once I found it, they were pretty much on board. reality, 99% of people around the globe live in jurisdictions that require some kind of human rights violation to access legal gender recognition, if they have it at all. Be that a requirement for divorce, for sterilization, for a diagnosis. And that means that on the planet, by far the majority of trans people are living with inaccurate, incomplete, or complicated documents.
So in some countries there is absolutely no procedure, and then people either cannot change their documents at all, or they somehow manage to find friendly people in administrative offices and change their documents depending on what the person decides to do. In other places, there are inhumane requirements, such as getting sterilized, getting divorced from your partner, suing your own parents, being hospitalized for up to a month, and so all sorts of different requirements. In other places, it's less severe, so maybe like you need only one opinion from, let's say, a psychologist or psychiatrist or something similar. Sometimes it's a court procedure, sometimes it's a medical opinion. And then there are the kind of best practice examples of countries where it's a purely administrative procedure, where you just you just go in, you fill out a form, and then it's your gender marker and your name, if you want to change both, are changed within a short while of usually a couple of weeks. The difficulties are usually bigger if you're, for example, underage, or if you're a foreign citizen, or undocumented, or a sex worker.
When it comes to transition-related care, that's significantly more complicated still, because there are several different barriers that all come into play at once. One of them is the requirement for a mental health diagnosis, which is no longer recognized as a reasonable requirement from the World Health Organization, but the new standards, the International Classification of Diseases number 11, haven't been implemented in most parts of the world so far, so that diagnosis requirement still exists, which means that you need access to a mental health provider willing to give the diagnosis. The second is about insurance, and many insurance systems don't cover transition-related care. So what that ends up doing is creating a poverty gap. People who are wealthy or stable financially can access transition-related care, and people who are not can't. And the final is that in, again, much of the world, especially in the global south, transition care, like hormones, can only be accessed through informal markets, which means there's no regulation, there's no safety for users or guarantees of safety, and there's no way to get ongoing care to make sure that you're taking the right amount. What we see is a small group of trans people who live in countries and have the means to be able to access legal gender recognition, and the vast majority of trans people who are barred from these things around the planet.
There's also the issue that often psychologists and psychiatrists act more as gatekeepers, so they kind of give an approval of whether a person is trans or not, and whether they are qualified to get access to hormones or surgeries or other things that they might need. And especially they might be more stigmatizing towards things that someone might need that are not fitting the typical male and female bodily norms. So for example, there are trans people who would only want to get top surgery, for instance, getting their breasts removed, and getting a more typically male chest, but they might not want to take hormones or have any other surgeries. And often this is not met positively by healthcare professionals. Or other times people might need, for example, a low dose of hormones so that they don't get as severe changes as would happen if you are on a full dose. And some medical professionals see this also as kind of not serious or not really trans. And then there are obstacles, which usually then means that trans people talk to each other and end up lying in order to get what they need, which then doesn't help anyone really.
do away with assumptions. Those are assumptions about you and also assumptions about your clients. Let me explain. Firstly, when it comes to making assumptions about your clients, if there is information that you need, ask. Ask in a non-stigmatizing, non-judgmental way, and only ask what's required for you to do your job. So if you need to know about someone's sex characteristics, their physical body, about their sexual practices, about how to refer to them, then ask those questions and ask them in a formalized way that you ask everyone. When you introduce yourself to new clients, say, my name is Dr. X and I use XYZ pronouns. Have your staff wear name tags that list their pronouns, you too. Put it in your email signature. What that does is create a welcoming environment for trans and gender diverse people because it tells them that you have thought about this and that you are very likely to respect their pronouns and their body when they come to you.
In terms of pronouns, a trans woman would most likely prefer to be called she. Some might not if they're not in that phase of self-acceptance and so on. So whatever the person requests, that should be respected. For example, several queer or non-binary people, they might use, in English it might be they, in other languages or even in English it might be a mixture of using he and she. So for instance, some people find it important that it's not only he or only she, but that it's sometimes one and sometimes the other. For some people, it might be different new pronouns that are not common. So whatever the person requests, it's important to be respectful.
And the last thing is about tests that people with certain sex characteristics might need to have. For example, a pap smear or a prostate exam. People who have a cervix need to have a pap smear. If you were born with one, or if you have and it hasn't been removed, then you still need one. Do you need this test?
If somebody needs trans-specific healthcare or legal gender recognition, it's also important just to respect the person's needs. And that might mean, for example, if someone doesn't need something that is a typical procedure, if it's medically safe and possible, then they should still be supported in this and not either ridiculed or obstructed. So for example, if it is a trans man or a non-binary person or queer person who needs phalloplasty, which is a procedure of creating a phallus or penis, but at the same time they want to keep their vagina, that is something that is absolutely possible in terms of medical procedures, and there are many people in the world who have had these procedures and live happily with them. So things like these, just because they are odd to us or new to us, doesn't mean that we should judge a person for this, but support them in it. It's also okay if a person changes their mind, if they're exploring their gender, especially because this world was not made for trans people. It was not made for anybody who doesn't fit stereotypical norms for men and women, whether in terms of body or appearance and so on. And then that makes it more difficult to realize what a person might need. And so the role of a therapist might be key in helping the person explore themselves and figuring out what they need, and reassuring them that it is okay to change and explore, and not to just have to prove that they are trans enough, which is often the case. Another aspect that might be important to keep in mind is that sexuality and gender are not necessarily tied. So, for example, you could have a trans woman who is only attracted to women, whether they are cis or trans, and so she would probably identify as a lesbian, and that might be the case for her before transition, after transition, maybe she doesn't even transition and so on, but she's still a lesbian if that's what she says. However, for other people, it might change who they find attractive. So, for example, a trans person might be attracted to, let's say, women, and then they transition and they realize that with the changes that have happened that they are actually attracted to men as well, or only men afterwards, or only non-binary people, etc. These are all possibilities because human sexuality is complex. And it is important to just keep an open mind and not have predetermined expectations or assumptions